Science and politics can be uncomfortable bedfellows. Good politics are typically based on science. They use science to inform and educate, and to make constructive decisions with good outcomes. Bad politics tend to warp, distort, or outright deny science, so as to fit some kind of ideological narrative or to justify bad faith or destructive actions. I can point to numerous examples of this happening in the real world, from oil-lobbied Republicans who deny climate change, to religious fundamentalists who ignore genetics, paleontology, geology, and cosmology. And then there's Australia, with many of its habitats suffering from invasive species that were brought there by humans, or by rampant pollution caused by their coal industry corruption. And then there's the Four Pests campaign in China in the mid-20th century, with its appalling ignorance of ecology that ended up leading to the death by starvation of tens of millions of people. There are endless examples throughout history of science being misunderstood, or distorted, or smeared, or just outright ignored, and this almost always ends up with a non-trivial amount of horror and suffering. Now, with this said, I've recently come across a number of articles and had a number of discussions with people online about the topic of social Darwinism. Much like eugenics, social Darwinism is a political philosophy that has a superficial and shallow connection to the actual science. Its application as a political philosophy requires a distortion of the science, and of reason, logic, and empathy, so as to justify whatever terrible political policy the eugenicist or the social Darwinist wants. Although they didn't call themselves social Darwinists at the time, people in the 19th century who were really influenced by Malthus, people like Herbert Spencer and Francis Galton, definitely capitalized on Darwin's recently published book on the origin of species to validate their political beliefs. Now, Herbert Spencer was actually the person who coined the phrase survival of the fittest after reading Darwin's work. And as Spencer was a polymath, or a contemporary expert in numerous fields like biology, ethics, philosophy, etc., he soon applied the fundamentals of evolution that he learned from On the Origin of Species to the human species, to human societies and political systems. Spencer was thus a kind of laissez-faire capitalist, who opposed government welfare systems, but insisted that private charity should provide relief for the poor, to prevent people from falling into poverty in the first place. Darwin had a half-cousin named Francis Galton, and even though Darwin's own work barely talked about human evolution at all, Galton was enthralled with this idea, and he really ran with it, and applied his interpretation of evolution to politics and human society with a Malthusian glee. Galton was the guy who coined the term eugenics, and opened it up as a field of study. Now, in the late 19th century, both of these guys were well-respected naturalists, who had both made major contributions to various fields, as Spencer did to sociology, anthropology, and political science, and as Galton did to psychiatry and statistics. But they weren't perfect, and both of them made many mistakes in their careers. Both of them were also at a disadvantage in a lot of ways, because they lived in the 19th century, and as we know, science back then wasn't as sophisticated as it is now. I mean, Darwin's own work on the origin of species is not 100% accurate, and so his contemporary peers who read his work would build their own perceptions of evolution, and then they would apply that perception to other fields. They would write multiple books about how the principles of evolution apply to human being and human society, and the whole time, none of them were getting any more accurate. It was like a game of telephone, where the farther out you go from the original source, people increasingly misinterpret evolution, what it is and what it can do. And if you combine the fact that evolution was only primitively understood at the time, and you combine that with the fact that all of this compounding informational decay makes it less and less accurate the more people you go out away from Darwin, and then you combine that with other popular ideas of the 19th century, like racialism and the Lamarckian idea of inheritance of gained skills and abilities, when you combine all of this together, you can really see how this would be a noxious mixture that breeds racist and supremacist sentiments. And you can really see how This would be the fuel to create a political ideology that, in the modern day, we are kind of repulsed by. So the fundamentals of natural selection were sloppily applied to human societies, and this gave rise to the Eugenics movement, which spread across the West, starting in the UK and then being adopted in Europe, Canada, and the US. In the early 20th century, the idea of natural selection had been warped and distorted to fit these political narratives, and soon governments were sterilizing people with so-called undesirable traits or undesirable genetics. In this time period, people like criminals, the mentally handicapped, those with low IQ, members of minority groups, people who were considered sexual deviants or perverts by the authorities, all of these people were subject to stuff like marriage bans and even forced sterilization, and this was all done under the name of eugenics and social Darwinism. The eugenics movement reached its ugly zenith during the height of World War II, where Nazi Germany used eugenics as justification for grossly dehumanizing and then mass killing the Jews, the Slavs, the Poles, and any Soviet prisoners they could get their hands on. After the war, during the Nuremberg trials, the Nazi defendants argued that their eugenics policy was actually pretty similar to that in the US, and that kind of soured everybody else on the whole eugenics idea. The formal establishment of human rights that kind of came into being post-World War II, as well as the disgust for Nazi crimes against humanity, these were both powerful incentives for the West to move away from eugenics. The murder of undesirable people became totally unacceptable, and after a while, so too did abominable practices like forced sterilization. You can see how this idea of social Darwinism has changed and radicalized over time, becoming exceedingly popular in the late 19th century and early 20th century before falling out of favor after World War II. And this is an important thing to pay attention to, because the fact that this idea of social Darwinism has changed so much should be strong evidence that it's a political ideology undergoing permutations. It's not actual science. The actual science has long since been left behind. Darwin would be horrified if he saw what was done by those who twisted his theory to suit their own purposes. So, why am I talking about this? Why is this relevant to our lives in the modern world? Well, for one thing, we're in a time where science has unfortunately been heavily politicized, almost always for the worse, and people feel inclined to pick and choose which facts suit them the best. It's come to my attention that there are apparently some number of people who think that understanding the principles of evolution automatically makes someone the worst kind of social Darwinist. I've had personal discussions about this, most recently with someone who claimed Richard Dawkins was a social Darwinist, by citing a quote from him about the suffering and misery that are inherent to life in the natural world. The natural world means wild animals, and forests, and rivers, and stuff in the real wilderness, but the person that I was talking to misunderstood, and they thought that Dawkins was talking about the suffering and misery of humans within human civilization. He misunderstood Dawkins because he conflated evolution with social Darwinism. There's also a recent news article going around today about a fundamentalist Christian couple who were recently sentenced to life in prison for letting their 10-month-old daughter starve to death. These awful parents didn't trust doctors. They said the doctors were part of a medical cult that were more dangerous to them than anything else, really. And instead of trusting the medical community and getting medicine and help for their daughter, instead they believed that the Lord would heal all of their diseases and ailments. And because of this belief, they didn't immunize any of their children, because the father thought it was all a big lie. He believed that evolution was analogous to social Darwinism, and he said, quote, "If evolution believes in survival of the fittest, why are we vaccinating everybody?" And he also said, "Shouldn't we just let the weak die off and let the strong survive?" This religious fundamentalist doesn't believe in evolution, because he thinks that evolution is some kind of satanic social Darwinian plot, and he doesn't understand why evolutionists, like doctors, would also promote vaccination if they purportedly want the weak to die. This misunderstanding about evolution, this misunderstanding that people who believe in evolution want these principles to be applied to human society so that the weak can suffer and the strong can thrive. This is a ridiculous mischaracterization and a misunderstanding, but it seems to be way more widespread than I first thought, which is what compelled me to make this video. Social Darwinism and eugenics, as we understand them today in the modern world, are extremely unethical concepts. They're almost cartoonish in their villainy. So the modern understanding is that the social Darwinist has some abstract concept of the strong or the fit, and they seek to promote the success of these people, of the strong and the fit, while simultaneously culling the weak or the unfit. And the idea is that as a whole, the society will improve, become more healthy and stronger and more fit, as the weak are culled and the strong are preserved. In a political sphere, this typically manifests as undue support for the financially successful, while vigorously opposing welfare policies that would help the financially disempowered. This kind of lawmaking attitude tends to encourage social division, and it promotes inequality. There seems to be this persistent belief that if we help the weak and the poor, we'll just enable them to be weak and poor. We won't help them, and this will accumulate to weaken society as a whole. Is this accurate? No, it's not. Race-minded social Darwinists treat humans like breeds of dogs, encouraging the marriage and reproduction of physically fit people who have some kind of racial ideal or fitness ideal, while opposing the marriage and the reproduction of the so-called unfit and the unhealthy. This take on social Darwinism that's based on race has been used for horrific purposes throughout recent history. It's been used as justification for the colonization and enslavement of third world countries. It's been used as justification for genocide, and even as justification for things as recent as America's prohibition on interracial marriage, which had the explicit intention of keeping the races pure. The fundamental problem with all of this social Darwinian thinking is that it's not scientific at all. It claims to be based on evolution, but it's not. It's less like evolution and more like dog breeding, but for people. You see, if we look at evolution, we look at natural selection and raw evolution in the wilderness, and we see that it will create organisms like the wolf. But then it takes human interference and artificial selection with humans selecting a small handful of their favorite traits that will selectively breed something as unhealthy and as unfit as a tiny lapdog, which usually has a weird skull, breathing problems, and joint pain. When we breed dogs, we tend to select the traits that we like, we avoid the traits that we don't like, and we tend to ignore the traits that we don't really care about. Preferred traits can be preserved, while unwanted traits are eventually bred out of the lineage entirely. Now, while we can use this method to get a dog with the traits we want, like a small, cute little body with a big head and big eyes, the dog itself is not healthy. The dog is sick, and it's in pain, because its body has been grossly distorted by an unnatural selective breeding process. Its cute little head is too small, and it leads to breathing problems. Its adorable, fuzzy little body is imbalanced, and it has joint pain. Its big, sweet eyes are too big, and they can literally pop out of its skull. There's so many problems with this, but we don't really focus on them because we're so obsessed with picking and choosing these preferred traits. We don't see that we're actually building up these big problems that are just lying right there underneath the surface the whole time. Now, with respect to humans, whatever traits are deemed valuable can potentially be preserved, but we don't know what traits we'd be losing, like traits that aren't necessarily cosmetic or immediately apparent by looking at someone's height or their skin color or their IQ. We could end up creating inbred humans, trapped in a gene pool with low genetic diversity. This would induce inbreeding depression across the entire human species, and that would be catastrophic. And unfortunately for the social Darwinist, there's no way to preserve traits without simultaneously lowering genetic diversity. Now, if we were to look at this from a more socioeconomic perspective, from a more financial perspective, social Darwinist policies don't make a society healthier. They don't make a society stronger. In fact, they make a society that's more divided, less stable, with more inequality and social stratification. Naturally, this breeds resentment and social unrest, and if it goes far enough, extreme wealth inequality is strongly associated with civil breakdown, violence, and revolution. It's kind of darkly ironic that by chasing the eugenicist dream of a pure race and a vigorous, healthy society, the social Darwinist will actually create an inbred race with low genetic diversity and an unhealthy, stratified, unequal society. So with all of this being said, you'll be hard-pressed to find someone who deeply understands evolution who is also a social Darwinist. Generally, having a deep understanding of evolution makes you realize that eugenics and social Darwinism are kind of clumsy, superficial ideas, and they don't work in the real world. Richard Dawkins, who talks at great length about the brutality of the natural world and the ever-present starvation, misery, and suffering that animals experience, is not a social Darwinist. He understands that evolution has also given humans powerful brains that have empathy and the ability to reason and use logic, and have the capacity to make comfortable societies that protect and enrich all of us. I'm in agreement with Richard Dawkins. We understand that the mechanisms of evolution are brutal and shaped by the deaths of the less fit. But we also understand that we don't have to apply these basic principles to our human societies. We have all the options in the universe available to us. We can create democracies or dictatorships. We can create federations or feudal kingdoms. And in the modern day, we even have the technology to create a kind of automated neo-communist technocracy that caters to our every hedonistic whim, should we choose to do so. But whatever kind of society that we choose to create, that's an issue of politics, not science and biology. And politics is not inherently bound to the harshest lessons of the biological world. It's a mistake to assume that it is. If you were to talk to someone who truly understood evolution, and you asked them what would be the optimal evolutionary eugenics policy, they would say that we would want to encourage as much interbreeding between human populations as possible so as to generate and then preserve as much genetic diversity as possible. If you take a handful of traits that you abstractly believe to be associated with a supreme race or a healthy society or whatever, and you try and preserve those traits within a single race, well, that's just a suicidal walk towards inbreeding depression. The science-based approach to creating a genetically healthy, stable, vigorous society is actually the opposite of what a lot of these eugenicists and social Darwinists have been saying for the last 200 years. You actually want to crossbreed between ethnic groups. You want to create and preserve genetic diversity. You want a broad range of different types of people, with different types of skills and attributes and values, so as to be able to respond to and survive any kind of problem that they might face, as a society or as a species. This is why evolution is not social Darwinism. Those who recognize evolution as a fact are not automatically social Darwinists. In fact, those who understand evolution deeply are unlikely to be social Darwinists. The true social Darwinists are few and far between. And much like how the eugenicist doesn't really understand genetics, the social Darwinist doesn't really understand evolution.